In this video, I want to talk about psychological labelling. With mental health being so topical just now, there's quite a lot of this going on. But is it a good thing? Does it actually help people understand their problem more, or does it actually make it much worse for them? Well, in this video, I want to first of all talk about what psychological labelling is, and then we're going to discuss the pros and cons. So what is psychological labelling? Well, this is where we get diagnosed as having some kind of mental health disorder. So we're having difficulties, we go to see our GP, they then refer you to a specialist, maybe it's a psychiatrist or a mental health practitioner of some sort, and they then take a look at you and they make an assessment, they make a diagnosis based on your symptoms. And often what they use to make this assessment is something called the DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, not the easiest thing to say. And basically the DSM is a manual containing a huge list of all the various different ways that we can get into difficulties psychologically as a human being. It contains all the different conditions, all the disorders that we can potentially experience. So things like, OCD or social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, avoidance, borderline personality disorder, a thing called histrionics, which is where we get all hyped up and too excited all the time, manic depressive, the list goes on and on. And in the DSM, there's roughly around about 300 different labels to describe the many different psychological issues that we can experience. So the specialist will basically take a look at you and they'll cross-reference your symptoms with the DSM and they'll come up with a name, a label to describe what it is that you're experiencing. So that is psychological labelling, but what I'm more interested in talking about in this video is whether or not that's a good thing. And I think the short answer is yes, but also no. There are definitely some pros behind psychological labelling, but there's also some big cons, some big disadvantages that I think people really should be aware about. So let's first of all take a look at the pros. So pro number one is that it reduces uncertainty. One of the big, troubling, really unsettling things about having a mental health issue is the uncertainty. We just don't know what's going on with us. That generally there's two different layers to having some sort of mental health issue. First of all, there are the symptoms, so the bad feelings, the negative thoughts, the destructive behaviours, and these alone can be horrendous. They can be really, really troubling and difficult to deal with. But then we have the second layer, and that is your reaction to the problem. And this is the uncertainty, it's the not knowing. And this is especially relevant in the beginning of some kind of mental health issue. And this is where you're like, I don't know what's going on here. Am I going crazy? Have I lost my mind? Is this me for the rest of my life? Am I never going to get better? Is my brain defective? There's all kinds of crazy thoughts that are going through people's minds simply because they're uncertain. They don't know what's going on. And this is actually a big issue from a human perspective. We struggle to deal with uncertainty a lot of the time. Some people find this more difficult than others. Say, for example, you lost your job, then there's a good chance you'll feel really, really uncertain and very unsettled and chaotic and all over the place for quite a long time. It's a bit like that, but magnified by 1,000, where you just don't know what's going on. Am I going mad? Am I losing my mind? So when it comes to psychological labelling, one of the benefits of it is that it takes something that is not known and makes it more known. All of a sudden, we have a way to describe what we're experiencing. We know that it's something that's been researched, that other people have, that doctors know about, that specialists know about. So it takes something that is really chaotic and all over the place, and we just don't know what's going on, and it actually makes it more of a known quantity. And this can be a real cathartic experience. I don't think it's to be underestimated, because all of a sudden we're like, oh, okay, we kind of know what we're dealing with here. We can actually get some sort of treatment. We can do something about it. So that's the first pro. The second pro is that psychological labelling can sometimes be used as a coping strategy. Now, I'll explain in a moment why I use the word sometimes, because it really depends on how people interpret that label. But psychological labeling does offer us the opportunity to be able to almost like disconnect from our problem temporarily so that we can look on it, stick a label on it, park it, and this can then allow us to look at it more objectively from a disconnected or a dissociated place. And this can actually lessen the emotional intensity. Labeling is a cognitive process. In order to label something, we have to first step out of it, look onto it from a more objective place. You could call this a dissociated space, and then make an assessment about it. We can start to understand it. So whenever we do this, it actually temporarily removes us from the intensity of the problem, the emotional intensity, so we can start to kind of like park it, put a frame around it, a label, so that we can then just allow it to simmer down and hopefully return to some kind of balance, some sort of normality. It's kind of like they've used the label as a way to step out of the problem temporarily, park it, just accept it, and then from there they can allow it to simmer down from that place. You can actually do this with any negative emotion too, by the way. If you take something, for example, like anger, it's very, very difficult to fight anger from within the anger. But if you just say to yourself, okay, I'm just experiencing anger here, it's kind of like you just label it, accept it, don't try to change it, and then that can just temporarily remove you from it, allow it to simmer down so that you can eventually return to a more balanced state. So that's the second pro, that it can be used as a coping strategy. So let's now take a look at the cons. So the first con is that often people can end up self-identifying with these labels, and this can end up making the problem much worse and can actually lead them to being stuck in it long term. Because the thing is, whenever we self-identify with anything, especially if it's a label, then we start to believe that it becomes an impenetrable part of our personality, that it's become woven into the fabric of our DNA. And when we start to believe that something is part of our personality or, our DNA, almost like it's there from birth, then it becomes something that can't be changed and we're stuck. The only solution is to then manage the problem basically for the rest of our life. And this is not true, but if we believe it's true, if we buy into it, then it becomes our reality, because that's the way the beliefs work. And you often hear this in the way that people talk about their problems. They'll say things like, I am such an anxious person, or social anxiety, that is me, that's just who I am, or I have an addictive personality. I'm sure you've heard that one before. This is where they're not really talking about their problems as active processes that are going on, things that they have learned and picked up over the past through their past experiences. Maybe it's trauma or just bad things that have happened to them. They're talking about them as static entities that have become linked and woven into their personality. It is basically who they are. It's something they've been given at birth. It's unchangeable. It's not something that can be shifted at all. And it's understandable why you would think that, because if you're consumed by a problem, it can certainly sometimes feel like it's part of your personality. But it's not really. Our personality shifts and changes over time, and you are so much more than your label. And there's actually a lot of research being done into this, the power of labeling. There's a famous sociologist called Howard Becker who wrote a book in the 1960s called The Outsiders. And what he was doing was he was studying deviant behaviour in teenagers. Now, at the time in the 60s, deviant behaviour was teenagers smoking marijuana. Oh, how times have changed. But what he found was that whenever a teenager engages in a so-called deviant act, that deviant act isn't enough to make it part of their long-term behaviour. But as soon as they are labelled as a deviant by the mainstream society, they're pushed to the outside of civilization, and that is when it becomes more solid. It starts to become part of their long-term behaviour. Why? Because they are looking to confirm that label. They're looking to confirm that thing that they are self-identifying with. And also other people react to them differently as well. And this is a second aspect when we start to self-identify with these labels. Other people can actually attach that label to you and start to see that label as part of your identity too. There's a really famous example in a book called The Psychopath Test by John Ronson. Thoroughly recommend you check out the book. It's absolutely fantastic. And basically the central character of the book is a guy who was up in court for GBH, so grievous bodily harm. And he was looking at doing maybe 2 or 3 years in prison, so his lawyer suggested to him that he pleaded insanity, because he would then go to a mental institution, he would do 6 months, he would get some drugs, some rehabilitation, and then he would come out of it afterwards. So that's what he did, and he successfully convinced the judge and the jury that he was insane, that he was crazy, and he got put to a mental institution, and then 20 years later he was still there. Why? Because he couldn't convince them that he was no longer insane, that he was actually okay, he was sane. Because as soon as he had that label put on him, everybody else in the mental institution, in the place, would see him as just being insane. They couldn't see anything outside of that label. And that's how powerful and potentially dangerous labels can be when they become attached to our identity. First of all, we become boxed in. We start to see it as an impenetrable part of our personality, something that can't be changed. But also, people change their behaviour drastically around you. If they start to see that label as being your identity, then they'll continually keep on confirming it. And that can often, again, keep us locked in the problem because they can't see beyond that label. So I think the only advice I can give you is that you're so much more than your label. Never attach some kind of negative label to your sense of identity. You're so much more than that. Anytime you do that, you're doing yourself a complete disservice. So that's con number 1, is that often people can self-identify with these labels. And when they do that, it makes the problem worse and it usually keeps them stuck in the long term. So con number 2 is that actually when you get down to it, labels don't really tell you much. So I would strongly argue that a psychological label is not actually a proper diagnosis. It's simply just a description of your symptoms and no more than that. A proper diagnosis is understanding what is going on with your psychology, the unique configuration in terms of how you're using your mind that is causing the problem to be there. So has there been some sort of past trauma? Has there been things in the past that you need to be resolved? Do you have some sort of limiting beliefs that you've bought into? Ideas about life that are holding you back? What is it that's going on in your subjective experience that's causing the problem to be there and for it to continually be there? That is a proper diagnosis, not some kind of psychological label that simply just describes the symptoms that you're experiencing. You see this a lot with physical ailments too. If we take a classic example, something like sciatica. So say you have a bad back, you go to the doctor and he goes, oh, you have sciatica. Now, I have a friend who's an osteopath, I have another friend who's a physiotherapist, and they, go crazy at this because they say there is no such thing as sciatica. It's basically just some kind of abstract label that's used as a kind of catch-all to describe so many different things that can be going on for a person. That sure, there is such a thing as the sciatic nerve, but there are a multitude of things that can be putting pressure on the sciatic nerve that's causing the back pain. So you've got to figure out what is the unique configuration for that person, what's going on in their body that is actually causing the pain in the first place, rather than just, attaching some sort of abstract label that doesn't really tell you much. Another example is something like IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. If you've ever had IBS, then I'm sure you'll be extremely frustrated because just the label IBS tells you nothing. It tells you that your bowel is irritated, but there's so many things that could be going on. It's not a proper diagnosis, it's just a description, and actually quite a poor one, of your symptoms. So I would strongly argue that psychological labelling is exactly the same. It's not actually telling you what is uniquely going on with you, the unique configuration of your psychology that is actually causing and maintaining the problem. So that's a second con of psychological labelling. Often people think that that is it. They've got the label and they don't have to go any further. But I would recommend you don't do that because it's not really telling you what's going on with you. You need to explore the issue in a bit more depth, really figure out what is going on uniquely with you, and then from there, that's the place that you can start to solve it and move forward. So that is 2 pros and 2 cons to psychological labelling. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Are there any I've missed? Have you been labelled? What was it like for you? Did you find it a good experience, a bad experience, or a downright ugly one? I'd be really curious to hear what you think. So that is all for today. If you liked this video, then please do give us a like and consider subscribing so that you can keep up to date with all future Mind School uploads as they get added. So that's all from me for today. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you later on.